Hello everyone, welcome to HIM 216. We're continuing our study of Chapter 6. In your textbook, please turn to page 124. And we're looking at guideline. We're still looking at root operation, general guidelines, and we're looking at guideline B3.3, discontinued procedures. And what this guideline tells us is that if the intended procedure is discontinued, then we code to the root operation that was performed. Basically, that means we code the procedure as far as it went. If a procedure is discontinued before any other root operation is performed, code the root operation inspection of the body part or the anatomic region that was inspected. And the example is that they had planned an aortic valve replacement, but it had to be discontinued after they made an incision in the thorax, and that's called thoracotomy. And before any incision was made in the heart muscle, because the patient became hemodynamically unstable. So this procedure is coded to an open inspection of the mediastinum. So if we were going to code that in PCS, obviously we are going to be in the medical surgical section, and then we are going to be in anatomic region general. This isn't an upper or lower extremity, so we have to choose anatomic region general. And then this is our root operation is inspection, so we're choosing J for that root operation. And then it's the mediastinum, so we choose C for mediastinum. Then our approach is open and there's no device and no qualifier. So our code is 0WJC 0ZZ. Let's look at inspection. In the index, if we do inspection mediastinum, you can see that it sends us to table 0WJC. And then we choose on it, and basically we're clicking on the approach and then the device and the qualifier. So now let's look at biopsy procedures. So this is B3.4a. When biopsy procedures are coded, we use the root operation of excision, extraction, or drainage, and the qualifier, which is the seventh character, which is diagnostic. The qualifier diagnostic is used only for biopsies. Now, sometimes the physicians will tell you that it was a biopsy within the description of the operation performed. He'll say biopsy of so and so. Sometimes reading the operative report, he will tell you that he has biopsied a certain structure. So in this example, a fine needle aspiration biopsy of the lung is coded to the root operation drainage. And why is that? Because they are using a needle to aspirate fluid. That's used with root operation drainage, a qualifier diagnostic. Biopsy of bone marrow is coded to the root operation of extraction with the qualifier of diagnostic. And the reason for that, and I would write these down, when they do a bone marrow biopsy, they put a needle into that bone, usually it's the iliac crest, and they suck out bone marrow. So it meets the definition of the root operation of extraction. And then lymph node sampling for biopsy is coded to the root operation excision with the qualifier of diagnostic. Now let's go to the top of page 125. And when they do a lymph node biopsy, they are taking out a few lymph nodes in a lymph node chain. And that's important. You have to distinguish between a few lymph nodes and the lymph node chain. When they're taking out a few lymph nodes, that's an excision. On the top of page 125, we have biopsy followed by more definitive treatment. This is B3.4b. So if they perform a diagnostic excision or a biopsy, an extraction or a drainage procedure followed by a more definitive procedure such as a destruction, and these are root operations, a destruction, excision, or resection at the same procedure site, then both the biopsy and the definitive treatment are coded. So the example for this is a breast biopsy followed by a partial mastectomy at the same procedure site. So they do them both on, say, the right breast. So you code the biopsy and then you code the mastectomy. Now, the biopsy is the diagnostic procedure. The mastectomy is the definitive procedure. It would actually be sequenced first. So for our example, we're going to code an open excisional biopsy of the left breast with a partial left mastectomy. So we're going to have two codes here. We're going to have the open excisional biopsy and then the partial mastectomy. And the partial, if this just said mastectomy, we would use a different root operation. So let's take a look at this. We're in medical surgical, and the root, our body system, is going to be skin and breast. And then for both of these, the root operation is excision. If this had not been a partial mastectomy, if it had been a total mastectomy, our root operation would actually be resection and not excision. But this is partial, so we're choosing excision. And this is the left breast, so our body part is left breast. We know that our approach is open. And now for the mastectomy, there is no qualifier. So that code is 0HBU0ZZ. That's the code for the mastectomy. Now for the biopsy is diagnostic. And so the only change in this code is that our qualifier becomes diagnostic. So that code is 0HBU0ZX. That X indicates that this was diagnostic, and the Z indicates that it was not. Now let's look at overlapping body layers, B3.5. So if we have the root operations of excision, repair, or inspection, and they are performed on overlapping layers of the musculoskeletal system, the body part that specifies the deepest layer is coded. So we code to the deepest layer. So the example here is excisional debridement that includes the skin and subcutaneous tissue and muscle is only coded to the muscle body part. It went that deep. So we don't code the debridement of the skin. We don't code the debridement of the subcutaneous tissue. What we code is the debridement of the muscle. So for number 9 on page 125, open debridement of the subcutaneous tissue and brachioradialis muscle right. Okay, so we know that we're in medical surgical and we are in muscles. We're coding debridement of a muscle. And a debridement is an excision. A debridement is cutting off a portion of a body part. That's the definition of excision. Now, I don't see the brachioradialis muscle listed here. So I'm going to click on body part, and it says radialis, so I'm going to assume that it refers to the radius. And go down here until I can find my arms, and I see brachialis muscle listed here. And then under lower arm and wrist muscle right, I see brachioradialis. So it's the lower arm. That's going to be my body part. So I'm going to choose lower arm and wrist muscle right. And then I know my procedure is open, and my qualifier is Z. Now, when they are debriding it, there is some reason they're debriding it. Maybe there is necrotic tissue. Maybe it's a very dirty wound that they have to suture. So typically in debridements, they are not diagnostic. They are not biopsies. So our code is 0KB90ZZ. Now let's look at bypass procedures. B3.6a. Bypass procedures are coded to identify the body part from and the body part bypassed to. So we want to know where we bypassed from and where we put it. When we bypassed, where did we take it? So that's the bypass to. So the fourth character, which is the body part, tells us where we went from, and then the qualifier, which is the seventh character, tells us where we went to. And so if we look at this example, bypass from stomach to jejunum, stomach is the body part and jejunum is the qualifier. So for this one, I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna put in bypass. That's my root operation. I'm going to put in bypass, and I'm going to put stomach. And that will send me to table 0D16. So I'm in medical, surgical, gastrointestinal, and then my root operation is bypass. So I am going from my stomach, and this is an open procedure. There is no device, and I am going to the jejunum, right? Yes. So my code for this is going to be 0D160ZA. So I went from my stomach to the jejunum. My root operation is bypass, and there is no device. Okay? I hope you're getting a little more comfortable with these. Now, we're going to talk about coronary arteries. And coronary arteries are classified by the number of distinct sites that are treated rather than the number of coronary arteries. So for instance, when I go into medical, surgical, and then heart and great vessels, you will see that there are not, I have coronary artery 1 site, 2 site, 3 sites, 4 or more sites. I do not have a body part for a specific coronary artery. It's based on the number of sites that were treated. How many bypasses did this patient have? The example they have is an aortal coronary bypass of 1 site. That site is the left anterior descending coronary artery, which doesn't impact our procedure code. And then 1 site is the obtuse marginal coronary artery. And when we look at these, that would actually be 2 artery sites. There are other factors that impact this. The approach is obvious. Sometimes they will perform coronary artery bypasses percutaneously endoscopically, but there are only a few surgeons in the entire United States that do that. Typically, they are going to be coded to an open approach. Now, the device, we'll study this in much more detail when we are in chapter studying the circulatory system, but when bypass procedures are done, they can either use autologous venous tissue, and this would be a saphenous vein that they harvest from the leg. It could be autologous arterial tissue, and typically they are using an internal mammary artery. It could be synthetic. It could be a non-autologous tissue substitute, or it could be no device. The qualifier specifies the vessel bypassed from. So where did they start this bypass? If they are doing an aortocoronary bypass, they are starting in the coronary artery. If they are taking an internal mammary artery, and they can go in and just unhook that internal mammary, go down to the heart, to the coronary artery that is obstructed, and then go to just past the obstruction and hook the internal mammary up there, and they can use either the right or the left internal mammary. They can use other arteries as well. Those are really much more extensive bypasses than we will code. But for our purposes, when we are determining whether the body part is one site or two sites, what drives the selection of the body part is the device. As long as the device is the same for all of the arteries, you can add them together. So if I'm using autologous venous tissue, which is the saphenous vein out of the leg, and I use that saphenous vein to bypass 3 coronary arteries, I can pick number 2. And then I can say it was open, arterial venous tissue, and I can say that it originated in the coronary artery, and this would be my code. However, if I am using a combination of arterial tissue and venous tissue, I am performing a different procedure on the coronary arteries, and they have to be coded differently. So I can use autologous venous tissue on 2 arteries, and then I can use arterial tissue coming from the right internal mammary on 1 artery. And in that scenario where I have a triple bypass and I use saphenous vein for 2 of them and internal mammary for 1 of them, I have to have 2 different codes because the procedures are different. Now, B36.C, this is where it tells us that if there are multiple bypasses, then we have to have a separate code for each site that uses a different device or qualifier. And the example here is aortocoronary bypass and internal mammary bypass, and they're coded separately. So let's look at number 11 on the bottom of page 125. And basically this tells us that we have a CABG. That's the term that we use all the time for coronary artery bypass graft. And this tells us that we have a left anterior descending and an obtuse marginal coronary artery. So we have two arteries. We have excision of the right greater saphenous via percutaneous endoscopic approach, and that's important because we also have to code the harvesting of that saphenous, and that approach is percutaneous endoscopic. And we also have a left internal mammary coronary artery bypass. We're going to have 3 codes for this. And our first code our first code is actually going to be 021093. And that's for the autologous venous material. That's when they're using the saphenous vein. Now, when they use the internal mammary, then I'm going to choose autologous arterial tissue, and they use the left internal mammary, so that code will be 02100A9. And then I have to code the excision of the saphenous. So I will go to the index, and I'm going to put excision vein, and then they used the greater saphenous, so I can put in greater saphenous, and they used the right greater saphenous, and we know that the approach was percutaneous endoscopic, and there's no qualifier, so the procedure code for the harvesting of the internal mammary is not the internal mammary, the greater saphenous, I apologize, 06BP4ZZ. So those are the 3 codes that we would use for our bypass procedure. And I'll repeat those again. 021093. And actually, that would not be a 3, that would be a W. We don't want coronary, we want aortocoronary. I apologize for that. That's coronary artery, one site, open, autologous venous tissue, and aorta. I apologize for that. Some of you that have been doing coding are probably thinking, what is she doing? So 021009W. And then for the arterial, for the internal mammary, 02100A9. And then for harvesting the saphenous, 06BP4ZZ. And that is going to conclude this lecture for Chapter 6. And your question for this lecture is to code a percutaneous breast biopsy. Percutaneous left breast biopsy. So let's do the left breast. Percutaneous left breast biopsy. What would that code be? And that will conclude this lecture.